Emily had always been an adventurous spirit, a fearless traveler who craved the strange, the unexplained, and the mysterious. Her latest trip was to a remote village in Asia, far from the bustling city life she was accustomed to. She and her friends had heard whispered tales of an ancient museum that housed relics of a dark and twisted past, artifacts from a long-forgotten religious sect who had dabbled in unspeakable horrors to gain favor from their dark gods. Emily's footsteps echoed through the narrow streets of the remote Asian village. The air felt colder the closer she and her friends got to their destination, a crumbling, ancient museum. They still heard the same unsettling whispers about it from the locals, legends of dark rituals, an accursed statue, and spirits that never rested, just as they heard back at home. But to Emily and her friends, it was all part of the thrill. After all, they had come for adventure. That morning, over breakfast at a small inn, an elderly man had warned them about the museum. His voice was shaky, his eyes clouded with fear. The Virgin of Stone, he had called it, a young girl turned into a living statue by an evil sect, long dead but never truly gone. He spoke of a ritual, a sacrifice meant to summon power from an ancient dark lord. They poured molten metal over her while she was still alive. Her screams still haunt the museum. The others, Jason, Anna, and Ben, had laughed at the old man's story, dismissing it as the village's attempt to spook tourists. But Emily couldn't shake the chill that crawled up her spine. Now, standing before the museum's heavy wooden doors, Emily hesitated. The place reeked of age and decay. Its walls, once grand, were cracked and worn by centuries of neglect. The sky above them had darkened, as if the sun itself dared not shine upon this place. She turned to her friends, but their faces were eager, full of reckless excitement. Jason pushed the door open with a loud creak, and they stepped inside. The museum was a labyrinth of dusty hallways and darkened rooms, each filled with strange artifacts from a time long forgotten. Display cases lined the walls, holding ancient bones, rusty swords, and grotesque ceremonial masks, but none of them could compare to what stood at the very center of the room. The statue, the Virgin of Stone. It was a life-sized figure of a young girl, frozen in a moment of pure agony. Her body was twisted as though she had tried to escape her fate, but had been held fast by the molten metal that now encased her. Her hands were raised, palms outward, as if she had tried to push the pain away. Her face was the most disturbing of all, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror, eternally frozen in the moment of her death. Jason approached the statue, a smirk on his face. So this is the famous Virgin of Stone, huh? Creepy, but I don't see what all the fuss is about. Don't touch it, Emily warned, her voice barely above a whisper. There was something about the air around the statue, something heavy and oppressive. It felt alive, like the spirit of the girl was still trapped inside, watching them. Jason, ever the daredevil, ignored her. He placed his hand against the glass case that surrounded the statue. What's the worst that could happen? The moment his fingers brushed the glass, the air in the room shifted. A deep, guttural sound, like a distant growl, filled the space. The lights flickered, casting long, ominous shadows across the walls. Emily's heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. Suddenly, a crack split the air. Everyone jumped. Jason snatched his hand back, but the damage was done. A long fracture now ran across the glass, spiderwebbing outward from where he had touched it. Jason, what have you done? Anna asked, her voice trembling. I didn't do anything. Jason shot back, his bravado fading. He looked at his hand, then back at the statue, now distorted behind the cracked glass. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows thicker, like they were closing in around them. Then, to everyone's horror, the statue moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight twitch of the fingers, but then the head turned, the eyes that had once been locked in terror now shifting, following Jason with a chilling, unnatural precision. Oh my God, Ben whispered, backing away. It's alive. Emily's stomach dropped. This wasn't a legend. This wasn't just a ghost story. They had awakened something ancient and evil. Without warning, the glass around the statue shattered, sending shards flying through the air. Jason, closest to the explosion, was thrown backward, his body slamming against the wall, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead, and his eyes widened in panic. The statue stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it was struggling to control the form it had been trapped in for so long. The air in the room grew colder, and the oppressive energy around them intensified. Emily could barely breathe. Jason scrambled to his feet, but before he could take another step, the statue lunged at him, its cold, metal hands wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground. He struggled, clawing at the statue's hands, but his efforts were in vain. The sound of cracking bones filled the room as Jason's neck twisted in an impossible angle. His eyes bulged, mouth open in a final, desperate grasp for air, and then he was still. The statue released his body, letting it crumple to the floor in a lifeless heap. Its cold, dead eyes turned towards the others, blood dripping from its fingers. Anna screamed, stumbling back towards the door. She grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she cried, her voice rising in panic. Ben ran to help, but no matter how hard they pulled, the door remained sealed. The room seemed to shift around them, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things, creeping closer with each passing second. Emily felt a cold breeze brush past her. Though there were no windows open, she turned, and her breath caught in her throat. The statue's eyes were now locked on her, and in that moment, she felt the full weight of the curse that bound it. This was no ordinary haunting. This was something far worse. Anna's screams cut through the silence. She had collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing violently. Emily rushed to her, but the moment she touched her friend, she recoiled. Anna's skin was ice cold, her lips turning blue, as though the life was being drained from her. "Ben, help me," Emily cried, but Ben was already backing away, his face pale with terror. I can't," he stammered. "We have to get out of here." Before either of them could move, the room was plunging into total darkness. The cold, oppressive air became suffocating, pressing down on them like a heavy weight. Emily could hear whispers now, faint at first but growing louder. They were in a language she didn't understand, harsh and guttural, like the chanting of the ancient cult that had summoned these nightmares. Then, out of the darkness, came a scream. It was Ben. Emily spun around, but she couldn't see anything. The darkness was too thick, too impenetrable. She reached out, trying to find him, but all she felt was cold, suffocating air. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. There was no sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. Only the sound of the statue's footsteps echoed through the room, slow and deliberate, as it moved toward Emily. Her heart pounded in her chest. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The door was still locked, the windows sealed. She was trapped. The statue stopped in front of her, its cold, dead eyes boring into her soul. Emily could feel the weight of the centuries of suffering, the pain of the girl who had been sacrificed to the evil god. And now, that same darkness was coming for her. A voice, cold and hollow, filled the room. "You cannot escape." Emily's vision blurred as the world around her faded into darkness. The last thing she saw was the statue's hand reaching for her, cold and unyielding, as the darkness consumed her. Days later, the museum stood silent once more. Only 2 of the group were ever found. Ben was discovered wandering the woods, blind and babbling incoherently about shadows and screams. Emily, bruised and broken, was rescued from the edge of a nearby river. Barely conscious, she never spoke of what happened to that night, but in the heart of the museum, the statue remained, waiting for the next foolish soul to awaken the darkness that lingered within. And somewhere, deep in the silence of the ancient building, the whispers continued, and the curse lived on. Emily woke up in a hospital bed, her body aching, her mind clouded by fragmented memories of that horrible night. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils, a stark contrast to the damp, suffocating darkness of the museum. She blinked at the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, trying to make sense of where she was. A nurse entered the room, her face soft with concern. "You're awake," she said quietly. "You're safe now." Safe? The word felt alien to Emily. Could she ever be safe again? She could still feel the cold grip of the statue's hand on her skin, hear the low, malevolent whisper of its voice promising that she could never escape. Where am I?" Emily asked, her voice raspy. "You were found by the river, badly bruised and dehydrated." The nurse explained. "You've been here for 2 days. Do you remember what happened?" Emily's throat tightened. How could she possibly explain the horrors she'd seen? The statues that moved, the shadows that whispered, the way her friends were taken one by one. It would sound insane. No one would believe her. "Where are my friends?" she asked instead, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse hesitated, her expression shifting to one of sorrow. "I'm afraid only you and Ben were found." Emily's heart sank. She had known. Of course, she had seen Jason and Anna die in the most horrific ways. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Ben?" Emily whispered. "Is he okay?" The nurse hesitated again. He's fine, but..." Her voice trailed off, and Emily felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "He's been talking about shadows, about seeing things. The doctors think it's trauma. He's blind now." "Emily, something must have happened, but we don't know what. He keeps asking for you." "Blind?" Emily felt like she was falling through a bottomless pit. This wasn't just an ordinary accident, or a freak incident that left them scarred. The curse had followed them. It had taken Ben's sight, and it had taken more than just his vision. It had stolen his mind, leaving him trapped in the same terror she still carried. Later that day, Emily found herself standing at the door to Ben's room. She hesitated before pushing it open, unsure if she could face him, unsure if she could handle the reminder of what had happened. But she owed it to him. He was the only other one who had survived. Maybe together, they could make sense of it all. Ben was sitting upright in the bed, his eyes bandaged, his head turned slightly as she entered, but he didn't say anything at first. Emily walked slowly toward him, her heart heavy. "Ben?" she said softly. He flinched at the sound of her voice. "Emily," he rasped. "You're alive." "I am, and you are too." He shook his head slowly. "I don't feel alive. It's still with me. I can't see it, but I can feel it. It's here, watching, waiting." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "It's never going to let us go," Ben whispered, his voice raw with fear. "The shadows, they whisper to me. Even now, they tell me that it's only a matter of time. We escaped that night, but we are still marked. It won't stop until we are dead. It's hunting us." Emily's blood ran cold. She had felt the same weight since she had woken up, an invisible pressure, like a dark cloud looming over her. She had hoped it was just her mind playing tricks on her, a result of the trauma, but hearing Ben speak of it made it real. It can't still be following us," Emily said, trying to convince herself as much as him. "We got away, did we?" Ben turned his head slightly toward her, though his eyes were hidden beneath the bandages. "Jason and Anna didn't. Do you think we are any different? It's just waiting for the right moment." Emily sat down heavily in the chair beside him. She wanted to argue, to tell him that they were safe now, that whatever had happened in the museum was over. But the truth gnawed at her. The curse wasn't something you could just run from. It was ancient, powerful, and relentless. Maybe we can find a way to stop it," she said quietly. "Maybe there's something we don't know, something we can do." Ben let out a hollow laugh. "Do you really think anyone's ever escaped it? That anyone who's ever touched that thing walked away free? It killed everyone in that cult, their families. It won't stop. It never stops." Emily's heart sank. She remembered the old innkeeper's words, how the girl's spirit had killed the cult members and their descendants. The curse was all-consuming, unstoppable, but there had to be a way. The next few weeks passed in a haze. Emily was released from the hospital, but she felt like she was walking through a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the statue, its twisted face, its cold hands reaching for her, and always, in the back of her mind, was the feeling that something was watching her, something ancient and malevolent. Ben's condition deteriorated. The whispers he spoke of grew louder, more insistent. He became paranoid, convinced that the shadows in his room were moving, that they were coming for him. One night, he tried to escape the hospital, screaming that they were going to kill him. It took 3 nurses to restrain him. Emily visited him less and less, afraid of what he might say, afraid that he was right. Then, one night, it happened. Emily woke up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding. The air in her apartment felt wrong, too cold, too still. She sat up, her breath hitching in her throat. The darkness in her room seemed to move, the shadows twisting and curling like smoke. And then, she heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, the same voice from the museum, the voice of the statue. "You cannot escape." Emily's heart raced as she scrambled out of bed. her eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing, except the feeling that something was watching her, something just out of sight, hidden in the shadows. She stumbled toward the door, her hands shaking, but before she could reach it, the room plunged into total darkness. The cold, suffocating air pressed down on her, and the whispers grew louder, filling her mind, overwhelming her senses. "You cannot escape." Emily's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The darkness seemed to close in around her, thick and impenetrable. She could feel it now, the presence, the curse, closing in, ready to claim her just as it had claimed the others. And then, in the darkness, she saw it, the statue. Its twisted, contorted form was standing at the foot of her bed, its eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. It took a step toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered again, echoing in her mind. Emily's vision blurred as the statue reached out its hand, cold and unyielding, ready to claim her. But just as the darkness threatened to consume her, something broke through, a light, faint, but growing stronger. The whispers faded, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for her to breathe again. She didn't know what had saved her. Perhaps it was pure luck, or perhaps there was still something fighting for her survival. But as the light pushed the darkness back, Emily knew one thing for certain. The curse was not done with her, and it would come again. Days later, Emily packed her belongings and left the village without a word. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. Not there, not anywhere the curse might find her. But no matter where she went, she carried the weight of that night with her. And somewhere, in the shadows, the Virgin of Stone waited, because it always did, and it always would. Emily's return to her hometown was far from the relief she had hoped for. She had thought putting distance between herself and the village might help her escape the creeping dread that haunted her. But the cold grip of the curse clung to her no matter where she went. Even in the familiar surroundings of her childhood home, the shadows felt alive, and the air was thick with the presence of something unseen. She hadn't heard from Ben in weeks. Part of her feared the worst, but another part of her, selfishly, she admitted, was too terrified to find out. In a last, desperate bid to save herself, Emily decided she couldn't face this alone. She needed help, real help, and she wasn't too proud to admit it anymore. The curse was relentless, and its grip on her was tightening with each passing day. She reached out to her closest friends, people she trusted, who wouldn't dismiss her story as some wild delusion. She called Claire, an old college friend with a strong sense of empathy and a passion for the strange and unusual. Claire had always dabbled in the occult, though mostly as a curious hobby. If anyone would believe her, it would be Claire. "I'm coming over," Claire said as soon as Emily finished explaining everything, her voice resolute. "We'll figure this out. I'm bringing someone with me." "Who?" Emily asked, feeling a sliver of hope bloom in her chest. "His name is Dr. Nathaniel Graves. He's a paranormal expert. You might call him a ghost hunter, but he's the real deal. He's helped people in situations like this before. Trust me." Emily clung to those words like a lifeline. That night, she barely slept. Her nerves shot, every creak and groan of her old house making her heart race. She felt the statue's presence more than ever, its cold, suffocating aura lurking in every corner of the room. She lay awake, eyes wide, unable to shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next afternoon, Claire arrived at Emily's house with Dr. Nathaniel Graves in tow. He was not what Emily had expected, dressed in a simple black jacket, with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He was more reserved and scholarly than the image of a ghost hunter she had in her mind. His eyes, though calm, were sharp and calculating, as though he could see more than what was on the surface. "Emily," Claire said softly as she hugged her friend tightly, "we are going to fix this." Emily tried to smile, but failed. "I don't know if it can be fixed, but thank you for coming." Dr. Graves stepped forward, his gaze steady. "I understand you've encountered something powerful, a curse, possibly ancient and deeply embedded in dark rituals. It's not uncommon, but every case is unique. I'll need to hear everything." And so Emily told him. Everything from the old man's warnings at the village into the night in the museum. She recounted the horror of watching her friends die, of seeing the statue move, of the oppressive whispers that had followed her ever since. When she finished, Dr. Graves sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the story. Then he stood and walked around the room, as if feeling the air itself. "Tell me," he asked, "has anything physical happened since you've returned? Any unusual phenomena here in the house?" Emily swallowed, her hands shaking slightly. "I've seen shadows move, and sometimes I hear whispers, like someone is standing right behind me. It feels like it's still here, like the curse followed me home." Graves nodded. "That's what I suspected. The artifact you encountered, the statue, was likely a focus of tremendous spiritual energy. It was used to bind a human soul to an object through suffering and sacrifice. When you and your friends disrupted its resting place, you became tied to its energy. It will continue to haunt you until the curse is broken." "How do we break it?" Claire asked. Graves turned to her, his face grim. "It won't be easy. Curses like this are designed to endure. They thrive on fear, pain, and suffering, which means that the more Emily experiences those emotions, the stronger its hold becomes. We'll need to perform a ritual to sever the bond. But first, we must weaken its connection to her." Emily felt a tight knot form in her chest. "How do we do that?" "First, I need to see the house," Graves said. "I need to determine where the entity is manifesting and whether it's drawing power from your surroundings. Then we can begin." The tour of the house was slow and deliberate. Dr. Graves moved through each room, holding a small pendulum in his hand, watching as it swung erratically in certain areas, especially near Emily's bedroom. He paused by the window, eyes narrowing at the air around him. "It's strongest here," he said softly. "It has a foothold in this space. This is where it's watching you." Emily's blood ran cold. "Can you see it?" "Not directly," Graves replied, "but I can sense its presence. It's been here before, waiting. It feeds off your fear. Every time you felt that dread, every time you believed it was near, it was growing stronger." He turned to face Emily. "Tonight, we will begin the ritual. You'll need to confront the entity. Face it without fear. It will try to manipulate you, to break your resolve. But if you stay strong, we can sever its hold." Emily's stomach twisted at the thought of facing the statue's spirit again, but she knew this was her only option. She had come too far to back down now. As night fell, Dr. Graves set up the ritual in Emily's living room. The space was dimly lit by candles, and the scent of sage filled the air. Graves had drawn a circle of salt on the floor, with sigils inscribed in chalk at each point. Claire stayed close by Emily's side, offering silent support. Graves placed an old, leather-bound book in the center of the circle. "This ritual will call forth the spirit that haunts you," he explained. "Once it manifests, I will begin the severing process. But you must remain calm. Do not engage with it, no matter what it shows you. It will use your memories, your fears, to break you. Resist it." Emily nodded, though her hands trembled. They sat in a circle around the book, and Graves began chanting in a low, steady voice. The air in the room grew heavier with each word, the temperature dropping until Emily could see her breath. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch and lengthen, as though the darkness itself was reaching toward them. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, snuffing out the candles. The only light left came from the faint glow of the sigils on the floor. And then, the whispers started. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed, low and menacing, just as it had in the museum. Emily's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel it, the cold presence of the statue's spirit. It was here, in the room with them. "You failed them," the voice whispered again, more insistent now. "Jason, Anna, they died because of you." Emily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice. She felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder, and her eyes snapped open. The room had shifted. The shadows had formed into the twisted figure of the statue, its contorted face staring down at her, eyes filled with malice. "Don't listen to it, Emily," Claire shouted. "Stay focused." Emily's heart raced, but she fought to remain calm. The figure of the statue loomed closer, its cold, metal fingers reaching out for her. It whispered again, this time in Jason's voice. "You left me there to die, Emily. You let it kill me." Tears stung Emily's eyes, but she clenched her fists. "No, it wasn't my fault. I didn't leave you." The statue's figure flickered, its form wavering as though it was struggling to maintain its shape. Graves continued chanting, his voice growing louder, more forceful. The temperature in the room dropped even further, frost creeping along the windows. The figure of the statue shrieked, a horrible, bone-chilling sound that pierced the air, but Emily held her ground, refusing to give in to the fear, and then, with a final, guttural roar, the figure disintegrated, the oppressive weight in the room lifting in an instant. The candles flickered back to life, and the air was suddenly warm again. Emily collapsed, gasping for breath. The ritual was over. Emily sat on the floor, her body trembling as the weight of the past few months seemed to drain from her all at once. The oppressive presence, the suffocating cold, the relentless whispers, it was gone. She could breathe again. Claire rushed to her side, wrapping an arm around her. "You did it," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're free, Emily." But Emily wasn't so sure. She had seen the spirit disintegrate, felt the shift in the air, but the weight of the experience still clung to her like a second skin. Could something so powerful truly be defeated in a single night? Dr. Graves stood, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes were sharp, still scanning the room, as though searching for any lingering signs of the curse. After a long pause, he spoke. "For now, the bond is severed. The spirit has been driven back, and it no longer has a foothold in this space." "For now?" Emily asked, her voice weak. Graves nodded grimly. "The entity was tied to you because of the curse. But that doesn't mean it's destroyed. It's ancient, powerful. What we've done tonight is weaken its hold, but it still exists. You're no longer directly bound to it, but you need to be careful. It may try to find its way back to you if you let fear or doubt consume you again." "So, it's not over." Emily's voice wavered. "It's a battle, not a victory." Graves said softly, "You've won this round, but the curse is a living thing, sustained by the energy of belief and fear. If you dwell on it, if you give it away back, it will return." Claire squeezed Emily's hand. "But you're stronger now. You faced it and survived. You can keep it at bay." Emily tried to hold onto Claire's optimism, but deep down, the thought of the statue still sent a chill through her bones. She had seen its eyes, heard its whispers. It was more than just a curse. It was a malevolent force with a hunger for destruction. Dr. Graves began packing up his equipment, carefully placing the book back into his satchel. "You're not alone in this, Emily. I'll be in contact, and if anything changes, you call me. Don't try to face it alone again." The following days were quiet, almost too quiet. The shadows no longer seemed to move. The whispers were gone, and the cold presence had dissipated. Emily wanted to believe it was over, that the ritual had worked, and she could move on. But sleep didn't come easily. She often woke up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced she heard a whisper or saw a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. Claire stayed with her for a few days, offering support and company. They spent hours talking, trying to process everything that had happened. But beneath their conversations, there was always the lingering fear, the knowledge that the curse might not be fully defeated. On the fourth night after the ritual, Emily was alone again. Claire had gone back to her apartment, and for the first time in weeks, Emily sat in her living room, staring at the walls, trying to convince herself that she was safe. The house was quiet, almost too still. She flipped through channels on the television, trying to distract herself, but nothing held her attention. Her mind kept drifting back to the museum, to that statue, to the night she watched her friends die. A soft creak echoed through the house, and Emily's body tensed. It was probably just the old wood settling, she told herself, but then it came again, louder this time, a distinct footstep. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. She didn't want to call Claire again, didn't want to seem like she was losing it. But the sound came again, this time closer. Slowly, she stood up, her eyes scanning the room. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, "just the house." She walked toward the hallway, her bare feet making soft sounds against the wooden floor. The air in the house felt different now, heavier, colder, as though something was watching her. She tried to shake the feeling, to push it away, but the dread crept back, slowly filling her mind. Emily stepped into the hallway and saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, standing at the end of the corridor, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall and distorted, its outline faint but unmistakable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming. It was watching her. "No," she whispered, taking a step back. "You're gone, you're gone." The figure didn't vanish. It remained, looming at the end of the hallway like a silent sentinel. Emily's body shook with terror. her heart pounding so loudly it echoed in her ears. She stumbled backward, her vision blurring as panic set in. Just as she was about to scream, the figure flickered and disappeared. The hallway was empty again, the shadows returning to normal, but the cold presence lingered, pressing down on her chest. Emily collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, and without thinking, she dialed Dr. Graves. Dr. Graves arrived an hour later, his expression grave as he examined the house once more. Emily sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to shake the lingering terror. Claire had rushed back, too, and sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. "Tell me exactly what happened," Graves said as he paced the living room. Emily recounted the events, her voice trembling. "I saw it again. It was in the hallway, just standing there, watching me." Graves listened, his brow furrowed. When she finished, he sighed. "I was afraid of this." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, her voice sharp with concern. Graves turned to face them. "The curse may have been severed, but it's still trying to reattach itself to Emily. It's not fully gone, it's just weakened. It's waiting for the right moment to regain its strength." Emily's heart sank. "So, I'm never going to be free of it, am I?" Graves shook his head. "You can be, but it's going to take more than a single ritual. This entity is powerful, and it has a deep connection to you. We'll need to do something more drastic." "Like what?" Claire asked. "There's a way to permanently bind the entity and trap it in a place where it can no longer reach you. But it's dangerous. You'll need to return to where it all started, the museum." Emily's blood ran cold. "No, I can't go back there. It's the only way," Graves said gently. "The curse is tied to that place, to that artifact. We need to trap it there. It can't be destroyed, but it can be contained." Emily's mind raced. The thought of going back to that museum, of facing the statue again, filled her with dread. But if it was the only way to end this nightmare once and for all, she had no choice. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Graves nodded. "Then we need to prepare. This will be our final stand." The days that followed were a blur of preparation and dread. Emily felt like she was living in a waking nightmare, every second of her life haunted by the impending return to the place that had ruined everything. Dr. Graves was relentless, gathering everything he needed for the ritual, a complex and dangerous one that would permanently bind the malevolent entity to the museum, trapping it forever. It was their last hope, but it required something Emily feared more than the curse itself: going back to the museum. Claire remained by her side, offering support, even though fear flickered behind her eyes. She tried to stay upbeat, encouraging Emily and reassuring her that everything would be okay. But deep down, Emily knew they were walking into something none of them could fully understand. Dr. Graves explained that they would need to perform the ritual directly in front of the statue, drawing the entity back to the artifact where it had originated. It would be dangerous. The spirit would fight to stay free, and the ritual would likely provoke it into its most aggressive state. But if they succeeded, it would be trapped forever, unable to harm anyone again. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they drove back toward the village. The landscape outside the car window was familiar, but instead of the curiosity she'd felt on her first visit, now it filled her with dread. As the museum came into view, a chill ran down her spine. The building stood as ominously as ever, a silent guardian of dark secrets buried deep within its walls. They parked near the entrance, and the weight of the place settled on Emily like a stone. The memory of Jason, Anna, and Ben hit her hard, the faces of her friends flashing before her eyes, as if their spirits were trying to warn her to turn back. "You ready?" Claire asked softly, placing a hand on her arm. Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was ready. She wasn't sure if she'd ever be ready, but there was no turning back now. Dr. Graves led the way, his satchel full of ritual supplies clinking softly as they entered the museum. The building was closed for the night, its eerie silence amplified by the creaking of the old floorboards beneath their feet. The air inside felt thick, like the walls themselves were watching them. They descended into the lower levels of the museum, where the ancient artifacts were housed. Emily's breath hitched as they approached the familiar door. Her heart raced, the terror of that night crashing back in vivid flashes, the statue's cold, dead eyes, the screams of her friends, the blood. "Stay close," Graves whispered, his voice barely audible in the thick silence. "We'll need to work quickly. Once the ritual begins, the spirit will resist. It will do everything in its power to stop us. Emily swallowed hard as Graves pushed open the door. The room beyond was exactly as she remembered it, though now it felt even more sinister. The statue stood in the center of the room, untouched, as if it had never left. Its grotesque form seemed to loom larger, its expression more menacing, more alive. The temperature dropped instantly as they stepped inside, and Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The cold, oppressive presence was back, stronger than ever. The entity knew they had returned. Graves wasted no time. He pulled out a small vial of black salt and began tracing a circle around the statue, muttering incantations under his breath. Emily and Claire stayed close, their eyes darting nervously around the room, the shadows seeming to writhe in the corners like living things. The ritual began. Graves' chanting grew louder, filling the air with a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through Emily's bones. He lit several candles and placed them at precise points around the statue, their flickering flames casting long, eerie shadows. Then, the room shifted. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, elongating into grotesque shapes. The temperature plummeted even further, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. The entity had arrived. Emily felt it before she saw it, the icy touch of malevolence creeping up her spine. The air thickened, and she knew the spirit was there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the room exploded in chaos. The candles flickered wildly, their flames sputtering as a deafening roar filled the space. The shadows in the room came alive, twisting and writhing like serpents as the statue began to tremble. Emily's heart raced as she watched in horror, the figure of the girl within the statue seeming to shift, its grotesque form straining against the stone. "Hold your ground," Graves shouted over the roar of the spirit. "Do not break the circle." The statue's eyes, cold, hollow, and furious, seemed to lock onto Emily, and a wave of nausea washed over her. She could hear the whispers again, louder this time, more insistent, as if they were coming from inside her own mind. "You cannot escape me," the voice hissed, filling her ears. "You will die like the others. I will consume you." Emily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, but it was relentless, clawing at her thoughts, tearing at her sanity. The shadows in the room surged forward, slamming into the walls with a force that shook the entire building. Graves stood firm in the center of the circle, chanting louder, his voice fighting against the roar of the spirit. "Emily!" Claire's voice broke through the chaos, and Emily's eyes snapped open. Claire was standing just outside the circle, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "You have to hold on." But Emily's resolve was crumbling. The cold was unbearable, the presence of the spirit suffocating. It was as if the weight of centuries of pain and suffering were pressing down on her all at once. And then she saw them, Jason, Anna, Ben. Their faces appeared in the shadows, twisted in agony, their eyes pleading with her, accusing her. "Why did you leave us?" Jason's voice echoed in the darkness, his face contorted in pain. "You let us die." "No," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to. You could have saved us." Anna's voice added, sharp and cold. "You didn't even try." The shadows closed in, suffocating her, and Emily's knees buckled. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, the weight of guilt crushing her. The entity was feeding on her despair, pulling her deeper into its grasp. "Emily, no!" Claire screamed, rushing forward, but Graves held her back. "She has to face it," Graves said through gritted teeth. "If she gives in now, we'll lose her." Emily's vision blurred as the faces of her friends swirled around her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, tearing at her mind. She was losing herself, sinking into the dark. But then, a voice broke through the chaos, a faint, familiar voice. "Emily, fight it." It was Ben, not the twisted, accusing version of him, but the real Ben, the one she had known before everything had gone wrong. "Don't let it take you," Ben's voice said, soft but steady. "You can do this." Emily's heart surged with a sudden clarity. She wasn't responsible for what had happened to her friends. She had done everything she could to survive. The entity was twisting her memories, manipulating her pain to keep her trapped. With a surge of strength, Emily forced herself to her feet, her fists clenched. "You won't take me," she growled, her voice firm. The shadows recoiled as if burned, and the statue trembled violently, its grotesque form beginning to crack. Graves' chanting grew louder, more forceful, as the spirit howled in rage. Now, Graves shouted, throwing a handful of black salt into the air. The room erupted in a blinding flash of light, and the roar of the entity filled the chamber, shaking the walls. For a moment, everything went still. The shadows froze, the air thick with tension, and then, with a final, deafening screech, the statue shattered, crumbling into dust. The oppressive weight lifted instantly, the cold presence vanishing as if it had never been. The room was silent once more, the only sound the soft crackle of the candles. Emily collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. Claire rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's over," Claire whispered, her voice shaking with relief. "You did it, Dr." Graves stood over the remains of the statue, his face weary but satisfied. "The spirit is bound to this place now," he said softly. "It won't be able to follow you anymore." Emily felt the tears streaming down her face, a mixture of relief and sorrow washing over her. It was finally over. The curse, the terror, the deaths, it was all behind her now. But as she stood, looking at the shattered remains of the statue, a single thought echoed in the back of her mind. Some things could never truly be forgotten. Emily sat on the steps of the museum, the warm breeze of the early morning brushing her face, as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon. The cold, oppressive presence that had weighed her down for so long was gone, leaving only a quiet peace in its place. For the first time in months, she felt free, truly free. Beside her, Claire sat with a soft smile on her face, her hand resting on Emily's shoulder. "It's really over this time," Claire said quietly, her voice filled with relief. Emily nodded, taking a deep breath and letting the fresh air fill her lungs. The nightmare was behind them. The dark entity, the curse, the museum, they were all part of a past that would no longer control her. She could feel the weight lifting from her chest, the fear and dread evaporating like mist in the sunlight. Dr. Graves emerged from the museum behind them, looking weary but content. "You've done it, Emily," he said, his voice kind and reassuring. "The spirit is bound to the place it came from, and it will never harm you again." "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. "I don't know how I would have made it without your help." Graves smiled. "You had the strength all along. You just needed to believe in it." As they stood up and prepared to leave the museum for the last time, Emily glanced back at the building. It no longer held the same terror it once did. The ancient horrors were still inside, sealed away, but they no longer had power over her. They were part of the past now, and she was ready to move forward. The drive back was quiet but peaceful. Claire hummed softly to the music playing on the radio, and Emily closed her eyes, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. The faces of her friends, Jason, Anna, and Ben, no longer haunted her. She knew they were at peace now, and she could finally let them go. Weeks passed, and the nightmares faded. Emily began to rebuild her life, slowly finding joy in the little things again. Long walks with Claire, coffee with friends, and the simple pleasures of a life free from fear. She no longer felt the presence of the entity, and for the first time, her nights were filled with restful sleep. One evening, as Emily and Claire sat on the balcony of Emily's apartment, watching the sunset, Emily smiled to herself. "I never thought I'd feel normal again," she said softly, gazing at the orange and pink hues of the sky. "You deserve this," Claire replied, her voice full of warmth. "After everything, you deserve to be happy." Emily nodded, her heart full of gratitude. She knew she had been through a lot, but she had come out stronger. And now, with the curse behind her, she was ready to embrace the future. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear, Emily leaned back in her chair, letting out a contented sigh. The horrors of the past were gone, and a new chapter was beginning, one filled with hope, peace, and the promise of a life unburdened by darkness. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt truly alive, and as she looked up at the stars, she knew that, finally, everything was going to be okay.